he utterly hated John Wayne. Now we know the reason why. Lee Van Cleef, born on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, was an American actor celebrated for his iconic roles in spaghetti westerns. Before pursuing acting, he served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and earned a Bronze Star for bravery. After the war, Van Cleef began performing on stage and soon transitioned to film, where his sharp features and piercing gaze made him a natural choice for villainous roles in westerns and crime dramas. His career breakthrough came when director Sergio Leone cast him in For a Few Dollars More, 1965, and later in the legendary The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, alongside Clint Eastwood. These films secured his status as a global Western icon. Despite a severe car accident that nearly ended his career, Van Cleef made a remarkable comeback, proving his resilience. He passed away in 1989, leaving behind a lasting legacy as the steely-eyed gunslinger of classic cinema, the humble beginnings of a cowboy movie icon. Lee Van Cleef's early Hollywood career was marked by small yet unforgettable roles that quickly established him as one of the most distinctive character actors of the 1950s. Following his chilling, silent debut in High Noon, 1952. Van Cleef became a familiar face in B-movie westerns, crime thrillers, and war films. With his sharp cheekbones, piercing gaze, and angular features, he was often cast as gunslingers, henchmen, and cold-hearted villains. He wasn't usually the leading man, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Throughout the 1950s, he built an impressive resume with films like Kansas City Confidential, 1952, The Big Combo, 1955, and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, 1953. He also appeared in popular TV shows such as Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Rifleman, further cementing his image as a rugged Western figure. In 1958, a near-fatal car accident nearly ended his career. A severe knee injury led doctors to believe he might never walk normally again. But with determination, Van Cleef recovered and returned to acting, bringing even more intensity to his roles. By the early 1960s, though still in supporting roles, his screen presence had grown. The spaghetti western era was on the horizon, and so was his stardom. The character that brought Lee Van Cleef to the top of Hollywood. Lee Van Cleef's rise to international fame was solidified through his iconic roles in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. His turn as Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, 1965, marked a major shift in his career, from silent villain to complex anti-hero. His chemistry with Clint Eastwood and his cold intensity gave the film its gripping tension. However, it was his role as Angel Eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, that cemented his legacy. As the chilling bad of the trilogy, Van Cleef's piercing stare and understated menace made him unforgettable. His performances relied more on expression than words, turning him into a true icon. He went on to star in Sabata, 1969, and Return of Sabata, 1971, showcasing his range as both ruthless killer and reluctant hero. By the 1970s, Van Cleef had become a defining figure in European westerns. His name alone could carry a film. The turning point that made Lee Van Cleef famous. In 1958, Lee Van Cleef experienced a near-fatal car accident that would forever change his life. The crash left him with a severely injured left knee, and doctors warned he might never walk normally again, let alone perform in physically demanding film roles. For years, Van Cleef struggled to find work. He was often cast in minor roles or forced to step away from the Hollywood spotlight altogether. It seemed as if his acting career had come to a quiet end. But just when all hope seemed lost, Italian director Sergio Leone gave him a second chance, despite still walking with a limp. Van Cleef was cast in For a Few Dollars More, Instead of hiding his injury, he embraced it, turning it into a powerful characteristic of his character: cold, mysterious, and dangerously intense. That moment became Van Cleef's rebirth, not just as an actor, but as a global icon. He transformed adversity into a personal trademark, proving that sometimes it's our flaws that set us apart and make us great. From that point forward, Lee Van Cleef was no longer the supporting villain. He was the unforgettable leading man the world never saw coming, the pinnacle of acting career. Lee Van Cleef's ascent to international stardom was nothing short of remarkable. After the unexpected success of For a Few Dollars More, it was his role in Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, that truly cemented his legacy. As Angel Eyes, Van Cleef didn't just play a villain. He redefined what a Western antagonist could be. With his icy gaze, sharp features, and restrained menace, he became unforgettable. In a film that would go on to become one of the most iconic Westerns of all time. His performance stood alongside Clint Eastwood's Blondie and Eli Wallach's Tuco as part of a perfect trio. But Van Cleef didn't stop there. Riding the wave of European adoration, he starred in a string of hits across Italy and Spain, such as Day of Anger, 1967, Death Rides a Horse, 1967, and Sabata, 1969. Each role built on his mysterious, hardened image, a man of few words but undeniable power. Unlike the traditional American cowboy hero, Van Cleef's characters were often morally complex, shaped by pain and betrayal, which resonated with post-war audiences across the globe. By the early 1970s, Lee Van Cleef was one of the highest-paid and most recognizable faces in the spaghetti western genre. Directors tailored entire films around his persona. Posters featuring his signature silhouette, tall hat, narrowed eyes, and clenched jaw became synonymous with gritty, gripping storytelling. Even in his later years, with roles in The Magnificent Seven Ride, 1972, and The Octagon, 1980, he remained a magnetic force on screen. At his peak, Lee Van Cleef wasn't just a Western actor, he was a symbol of second chances, silent strength, and the timeless power of presence. He had turned pain into performance and left an indelible mark on cinema history. The achievements that made the immortal name of a silver screen legend. Lee Van Cleef's career was not only marked by memorable performances, but also by a string of impressive achievements that solidified his place in cinematic history. Although he never received major Hollywood awards, his success was measured differently, by the lasting impression he left on audiences and the influence he had on the Western genre. In the golden age of spaghetti westerns, Van Cleef became one of the genre's most recognizable and respected faces. Unlike many of his peers, he rose to fame later in life, a rare feat in Hollywood, and did so with grit, charisma, and a magnetic on-screen presence. He starred in more than 90 films over his career, a remarkable number by any standard. His performances in For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly remain cultural landmarks, and he continued to headline films like Sabata, Barquero, 1970, and The Big Gun Down, 1966, each earning critical and commercial acclaim in Europe. These films proved that Van Cleef was not a one-note villain. He could carry complex roles that demanded subtlety, toughness, and emotional depth. His iconic image, the sharp cheekbones, the steely eyes, and the quiet menace, became a template for anti-heroes across decades. Directors and screenwriters began crafting roles specifically for Van Cleef, building entire narratives around his commanding persona. His international appeal brought American westerns to new audiences, especially in Europe, where he was often regarded as a bigger star than many of his American contemporaries. In 1983, Van Cleef was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a fitting tribute to a man who defied the odds and carved out a lasting legacy. While he may have been overlooked by traditional award shows, his real reward was the deep admiration of fans and the enduring presence of his characters in popular culture. Lee Van Cleef's family and married life. Beyond the gunslinging characters and stoic screen presence, Lee Van Cleef's personal life was marked by moments of quiet complexity. He married his first wife, Patsy Ruth, in 1943, long before Hollywood fame came knocking. Together, they had 3 children, Alan, Deborah, and David. For a while, their family life was steady and traditional, even as Lee pursued a demanding acting career. But like many actors of his era, fame came at a cost. The long absences on film sets, the physical toll of action roles, and the relentless travel slowly strained their relationship. They eventually divorced in 1960 after 17 years of marriage. In 1976, Van Cleef found love again and married Barbara Havalone, with whom he would remain until his death. Barbara became not only his life partner, but also a stabilizing force during his later career years. She supported him through health challenges, including ongoing pain from his leg injury and heart issues in his final years. Despite his tough guy image, those close to him described Lee as surprisingly gentle, quiet, and even shy off-screen. He enjoyed painting, sailing, and spending time with his children whenever possible. Though his film roles often painted him as the villain or lone outlaw, in real life, Van Cleef deeply valued loyalty, family, and the few close relationships he allowed into his guarded world. The feud between Van Cleef and John Wayne. Behind the stoic eyes, an iconic squint of Lee Van Cleef lay a professional rivalry that few knew existed, one that quietly simmered between him and the legendary John Wayne. Though they never shared significant screen time, the tension between the two men ran deep, and it wasn't rooted in jealousy, but in ideology. Van Cleef, the complex outsider, and Wayne, the embodiment of American patriotism, were opposites in more ways than one. The source of the rift began during the early 1960s, when Westerns dominated Hollywood. John Wayne was the undisputed king of the genre, known for his flag-waving, conservative image both on and off screen. He believed in a strict moral code, often playing righteous sheriffs or war heroes. Van Cleef, on the other hand, represented something darker, more morally ambiguous. His characters were drifters, bounty hunters, men shaped by hardship rather than virtue. Rumor had it that Wayne viewed Van Cleef's rise, especially through spaghetti westerns, as a threat to the true American Western. He allegedly dismissed Van Cleef's films with Sergio Leone as un-American and too violent. Van Cleef, in turn, resented Wayne's self-righteousness and dominance over Hollywood's casting circles. According to insiders, Wayne once blocked Van Cleef from being cast in a major studio film, saying, "There's only room for one kind of cowboy in this town." Though Van Cleef never spoke publicly about the feud, he alluded to it in interviews. He once said, "Some people want heroes in white hats. I prefer mine with scars and stories." That quote, many believe, was a quiet jab at Wayne's clean-cut, black-and-white worldview off-screen. Their political differences added fuel to the fire. Wayne was a staunch Republican, vocal in his criticism of the counterculture. Van Cleef, though not overtly political, associated more with Europe's liberal art scene and favored deeper, more introspective storytelling. Hollywood insiders often noted that when Van Cleef's name came up in casting conversations for American projects, Wayne's camp would discourage it. This quiet sabotage pushed Van Cleef further into the arms of European cinema, a decision that ultimately shaped his legend. Ironically, while John Wayne was cementing his status in Hollywood, Van Cleef was becoming a cult icon overseas, revered for the very traits Wayne criticized: emotional complexity, moral ambiguity, and raw authenticity. Though both men carved legendary paths, their divide reflects the broader clash between old-school American idealism and the rising appetite for anti-heroes. In many ways, Van Cleef's career stood as a rebellion, not just against Hollywood convention, but against the John Wayne mythology itself. And while Wayne left behind monuments, Van Cleef left behind mystery, the roots of Lee Van Cleef's feud. The rift between Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne wasn't just a disagreement. It was a battle between two opposing ideologies that mirrored the deeper divisions within Hollywood. Wayne, the iconic symbol of traditional American values, believed in heroes who stood tall, clean, and righteous. In contrast, Van Cleef embodied the grittier, more ambiguous side of storytelling, portraying men shaped by loss, betrayal, and moral complexity. Tensions first surfaced quietly in casting decisions and backstage whispers. Wayne reportedly saw Van Cleef's success in European spaghetti westerns as a corruption of the true American cowboy. He dismissed Van Cleef's characters as dirty gunslingers and grew wary of his rising influence. The turning point came when Van Cleef was up for a lead role in a major production Wayne had influence over. Wayne's alleged comment, "He's not our kind of man," cut deep. For Van Cleef, it became personal. From then on, he embraced the role of the outsider, challenging the sanitized mythology Wayne represented. His characters weren't perfect, but they were real. In this unspoken Hollywood standoff, Van Cleef didn't just survive. He redefined what it meant to be a Western legend. A quiet death, but made the whole world moved. As Lee Van Cleef entered his final years, the intensity and edge that had defined his on-screen persona slowly gave way to a quieter, more introspective reality. Though he remained active in film well into the 1980s, his body had begun to bear the weight of decades filled with stunts, injuries, and personal battles. One particularly haunting reminder was the lingering pain from his 1958 car accident, a pain that never truly left him. On December 16, 1989, Lee Van Cleef died at the age of 64 in his home in Oxnard, California. The official cause was a heart attack, though reports also indicated that he was battling throat cancer in his final months. For fans around the world, the news was both shocking and strangely poetic. The man who had played so many fearless, relentless characters on screen had been quietly fighting his own war behind the scenes. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Van Cleef did not fade into obscurity. His death sparked renewed interest in his films and legacy, with tributes pouring in from around the globe. Though his passing was not surrounded by scandal or mystery, it carried a somber weight, the end of an era for the grittier, morally complex Western hero he had come to embody, the immortal legacy of an iconic silver screen. Lee Van Cleef's legacy stretches far beyond the dusty trails of spaghetti westerns or the sharp glint of his steely gaze. He didn't just play outlaws. He redefined them, with his chiseled features, piercing eyes, and menacing calm. Van Cleef turned supporting roles into unforgettable figures and, later, transformed into a leading man who never had to raise his voice to command the screen. He brought a rare blend of danger and dignity to every role, crafting characters who were as mysterious as they were magnetic. His influence echoes through generations of actors and filmmakers who cite him as a symbol of restraint, control, and charisma. From Quentin Tarantino's stylized tributes to modern Western anti-heroes, Van Cleef's presence can be felt even today. His portrayal of morally ambiguous men paved the way for more complex, layered roles in action and Western genres. But perhaps Van Cleef's greatest legacy is how he inspired perseverance. His comeback after a near-fatal car crash, his rise from being typecast as a villain to becoming an international star, and his relentless commitment to craft all serve as reminders that greatness often comes not from ease, but from adversity. Today, Lee Van Cleef remains not just a face in old posters, but a legend, a man who carved out a place in cinematic history not by shouting, but by staring into the soul of the camera and never blinking. Life lessons from an imperfect icon. Fame gave Lee Van Cleef a second life, but it also took something from him. While millions admired his steely presence on screen, few saw the isolation, the physical pain, and the quiet sacrifices he endured behind the scenes. Fame demanded that he always be the tough guy, even when his body and soul ached for peace. It kept him working, but not always fulfilled. The price of staying relevant meant suppressing vulnerability and carrying the weight of expectations. In the end, his story is a powerful reminder that fame is not always a reward. Sometimes, it's a burden in disguise.